Matt, as I'm gonna say in the actual intro, I'm hoping you're gonna be a regular guest once a month to talk about something that maybe people think is boring, but when you actually scratch the surface at all, it's not boring. In some ways, it's the most important thing that you can actually do in the context of everything we do here. But before we get to that, who are you? Introduce yourself to the listeners. Who is Matt McClintock, and how did we meet?
Well, I'm Matt McClintock is a transplanted Okie. I grew up in Oklahoma, went to college and ultimately law school there, practiced estate planning in Oklahoma for a handful of years, had a family there, and transplanted to Colorado about 13 years ago, just as a lifestyle move. My career has really been focused on substantive estate planning. That's what I focused on in law school. Graduated in 2000, and that's literally all I've done. It's about the only thing I'm nominally competent to do. But for about a little over a decade, my primary responsibility was working for a company that provides document assembly services and tools and a lot of substantive legal education for other estate planning attorneys. So I spent the better part of a decade where my primary responsibility was digging deep on various substantive estate planning strategies, figuring out how to talk about those in ways that are understandable, doing a lot of jurisdictional comparison, how different states and sometimes different nations apply the law to various estate planning issues, and then teaching those to other estate planning attorneys. And then left that company in 2016 to start a couple of businesses. One is a law practice called Evergreen Legacy Planning that we're currently in the process of winding down, because Evergreen Legacy Planning led to the creation of a multifamily office called the Bespoke Group. And I'm sure we can kind of talk about what that's all about. But we saw an interesting opportunity for some of our clients to provide more longitudinal strategic advisory services to them, specifically around some of their unusual assets. And that has really taken off to the point where we can't do really those two things separately. We can't maintain the law practice and the family office. So we are leaning fully into the family office. But my world has been substantive estate planning. Aside from that, I'm a car nut. I'm an avid reader. I love nature. I love exploring. I love thinking, and I love listening to your podcast. So, yeah.
Oh, well, and now you get to, well, I never listen to myself, so you'll see if you'll listen to yourself. And you said that, being a lawyer was the only thing you were qualified to do. You take apart cars for fun, so I think you're qualified to do that as well.
Well, the trick is putting them back together. That's the hard part.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, when you hear a word and you sort of have to look it up or want to check yourself on it, and then you hear that word everywhere. Longitudinal. I hadn't heard that word in a long time. I'm not even really sure I knew what it meant. And then I Googled it, and then I was listening to Peter Attia's podcast yesterday, and his guest used the word longitudinal 10 different times in the context of the health of the liver. And now you're telling me about longitudinal in the context of estate planning. It's just following me around. Maybe we'll name this the longitudinal podcast. I don't know. But before we sort of get into the brass tacks here, Tell us about Bespoke Group. And so Bespoke and CI have a strategic partnership. We've talked about this a little bit in public. We have not talked about it in depth on the podcast, but tell us about Bespoke Group and the interesting things that are happening there.
Yeah, well, Bespoke Group, as I kind of suggested a few minutes ago, is the evolution of some services that we started providing for our very first client who had significant holdings in Bitcoin. And I know this is not going to be a Bitcoin podcast necessarily, but it is germane to how Bespoke came to be and what we've kind of focused on. So in 2017, fourth quarter 2017, one of the attorneys that I had done a lot of education for came to me and said, "Hey, I've got this client worth about $150 million, and will you help me create the strategies appropriate for their estate?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, that's what we do." And she said, "Well, the vast majority of their wealth is in Bitcoin." And it was like a record scratch moment. I didn't know anything about Bitcoin. I mean, I'm not even sure I'd heard the word at that point. And I said, "Well," and I was just candid with her. I said, I don't know anything about it. I'll start to learn about it. And then back then, Googling Bitcoin in 2017, it kind of took you to all of these sketchy type of things like the Silk Road and the Mt. Gox hack that had taken place a few years earlier. And there was a lot of acrimony in this very tight knit community. And I thought, well, I don't know. I may be opening up a can of worms if I go down this road. And I guess to a certain degree, to fast forward, I guess I was opening up a can of worms. But I sat down with my friend and these prospective clients, and I was just enraptured by the personalities of these people that I was able to meet, and became fascinated by what Bitcoin is, the origin story of Bitcoin, kind of the monetary policy underlying it. And my interest was truly piqued at that point. And so I was talking with my business partner in the law firm, and I said, the answer simply cannot be that people who have Bitcoin as a significant part of their wealth can't find somebody to do their planning. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a young couple with a child with a tremendous amount of wealth that is marketable, it is liquid, it is convertible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it's real wealth, but it can't simply be that nobody's going to help them because they're not going to understand the asset. And so we said, if we can understand this asset, and if we can understand how to substantiate the transfer of ownership from an individual to various estate planning structures that might be optimized for tax, privacy, asset protection, and other things, if we can make that switch from an individual to a structure, then every strategy that we've ever done in the history of estate planning is on the table for Bitcoin, just like it is for real estate, just like it is for closely held companies, just like it is for equities, whatever. And that was the light bulb moment that got us first into planning for clients with Bitcoin. As is, our approach in the practice has always been very relational. We've never billed by the hour. We're project based. And we just kind of walk alongside the client until the strategies are complete. And through that process, we developed a deep relationship with this client. And they started saying, well, I haven't found anybody to help me with other wealth structuring, and I don't want to be the one in the chain of title for my own real estate. So what can you do for that? And thinking about it a little bit more, we said, well, we could create another company that is our company that you could hire to be the manager of your limited liability company. You can hire us to structure things like your multi-signature controls for your Bitcoin wallets. We can help you facilitate private banking and things like that. And we accidentally became a virtual fractional family office for this first person. And because we were creating something tailor-made for this client, the word that came to mind was bespoke. And at the time, like nobody else in my immediate circle had ever heard the word bespoke, kind of like longitudinal. It was like, but guys, that's exactly what we're doing. It's tailor-made to what this client needs. And so the name kind of stuck. And because of our history in Jonathan, my business partner, and I both have done so much public speaking on estate planning, we started creating estate planning for crypto presentations that we would deliver to other estate planning attorneys, other financial advisors, CPAs, trustees, all that kind of stuff, talking about the intersection of estate planning and crypto. And there was a deep appetite for that. And before long, we got known as the guys who can do planning for crypto. And through 2018, 2019, 2020, we start getting more and more and more traction in that space where the big whales, the people with tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars worth of crypto, got wind of what we're doing. And we did a lot of work in the estate planning practice. And then that led over into the family office space. And so we restructured a couple of years ago inside Bespoke to become an RIA inside of Bespoke. So we're now, we think we are still the only SEC registered multifamily office with a deep and unique skill set for emergent wealth, especially in the crypto and Web3 and Bitcoin space. We do a lot more than that, but that's just part of, that's probably where we first became known. And kind of tying it back to a lot of our CI work with you guys, when the clients that we've seen have made this tremendous amount of wealth in a highly volatile asset, and now they're looking to maybe take some chips off of the table and sell some Bitcoin. We help them structure that in tax efficient ways. We help them reinvest in very private ways where they can enjoy their wealth. And a lot of them want to express a certain worldview through their investments. And we get to work with you in helping to design those portfolios for clients that are appropriate.
Yeah, expressing a worldview while still hopefully growing, but also at the minimum protecting wealth. Lots of people out there are expressing views with their wealth and losing money.
A lot of them are expressing it with crypto and losing money too. I mean, there's, but they're also making it.
I'm glad you didn't go with the name TaylorMade, because then you would have had a whole Taylor Swift problem on your hand as you were trying to scale up in general.
Yeah.
But I'll make things a little personal on the podcast here too, because I've been thinking about this myself. Because as listeners, if you've been listening for a couple months, my dad recently passed. And Matt, I don't think I've told you this. I'm looking forward to watching your hair light on fire like mine has recently. So I thought my dad had everything planned. Well done. Like there was a will. I took it to the probate court. Everything was fine. Like blah blah blah. And then it came time to start deeding the property. So, my sister and I splitting, I don't have to go into the details there. Turned out the property is in both my dad and my mom's names. Mm-hmm. So I had to figure out, and then it turned out that my mom's will was in the safe deposit box. And it turned out that mom's will had never been submitted to the probate court. And it also turned out that mom's will has a different executor, because it was dad and her sister if anything happened to them, because she made the will quite a long time ago. So now I get to go probate my mother's will. I get to go petition the court to recognize me as the executor. Hopefully my aunt, if she's listening, I haven't told you this yet, but hopefully you will agree to waive your not to serve as the executor. All of which is to say, a lot of what we talk about on this podcast is what to own. That's what Rob and I, spend a lot of our time thinking about. But the questions that, you guys have raised, and which I've thought about much more seriously since meeting you, is what to own is like the fun part at the end. That's sort of like to give a Bitcoin pizza party a shout out. Like that's the pizza party at the end. Like that's the fun stuff. But before we get there, it's really how and where. And I sort of, fronted this with, I think people will hear estate planning and they'll be like, oh God, like, do I really want to listen to this? And I'm telling you, yes, you really do want to listen to this, because the where and how, once you actually sort of get familiar with the questions, is just as interesting as the what, and the way that they all interact together is just as interesting as the what. And it's also in the same way that, people who own Bitcoin, or if you choose what assets you want to own, like you are exercising some measure of self-sovereignty, of choice in that way. But if you actually figure out the what and how, the where and how, now you're really sort of making some decisions about your own personal sovereignty. So there's a little personal aside, but I thought I would, levy up that grapefruit of a fastball and say, talk to us about the where and the how, and how important that is to even thinking about any of these types of structures, so that poor Jacob doesn't end up probating two wills and waiving executorships and all other sorts of things.
Man, I wish I could tell you that was the first time I've heard a story like that. But unfortunately, it wouldn't be true. Yeah, everything that we think about in the context of estate planning really deals with the how to own your assets, and as you suggested, also where to own the assets. And I want to come back to what I refer to often as the recursive function, which is why, and we can kind of land on the purpose behind it as well. But as you're kind of unfortunately discovering on your own, even the how to own your assets is not a one-time decision that then becomes this static thing. It needs to be iterative, because things change. The will that your mom had made many years ago was probably inconsistent with what her final wishes would have been when she ultimately passed away. And that's just so true, because it's very easy to think of estate planning as this kind of hold your nose and swallow hard and just kind of do it chore to get your financial advisor off your back, or to get your CPA off your back, because that's what grown-ups do. And so we get an estate plan and then we forget about it. But there is so much that has to go into the decision making around how you ultimately own your assets. And the reason we feel this way, we focus on the how to own and the where to own before we even talk about the what to own, because you can have the best investment strategy in the world. You can You can have the best advisors in the world. You can make all the right decisions from a investment performance perspective. But if you haven't mitigated the risk on what happens from a tax erosion perspective, what happens to maybe mitigate the impact of attorneys having to get involved to guide through a probate process, if you haven't mitigated what might happen if you were to be sued, whether it's sued for divorce, whether it's sued from a business partner, whether it's sued from just a rando that you happen to hit in a car accident or something like that. And if you haven't thought about how to preserve the wealth, however vast or modest your wealth is, if you haven't thought through how you prepare the inheriting class to receive that wealth in a way that makes them become the fullest versions of themselves, then you've left all the key decisions on the table. And your point about sovereignty is right on, because the fun fact is everybody's got an estate plan anyway. It's just, unless they've done it proactively, it's probably not the estate plan that they would want, because every jurisdiction in the country has default laws that the state legislature, in their immense and infinite wisdom, probably no joke, a century ago, set these default rules of descent and distribution of property. So generally speaking, it's very different from state to state, but as a general rule, if you don't have any type of proactive plan and use default to the rules that the state statutes have, odds are, if you are married but have no kids, your spouse gets half and your parents get half if you still have parents. If you don't have parents, maybe your spouse is lucky enough to get all of it. But if you're married and have children, your spouse probably gets half, but then your children get the other half, even if your children are minors at that point. Well, do you really want to have your children now legally own half of the wealth that you and your wife built together? Probably not. And even if that is what you want, you still have to go through the judicial process called probate in order to have somebody appointed as your decision maker, talk to somebody at the courthouse. We were talking about the septuagenarian in the black robe. Some probate judge is going to listen to that case amid their family court and their meth cases and everything else that they've got on their docket, and they're going to talk about your private financial affairs. So then, what we say is, as an exercise in sovereignty, you have to at least take charge of your planning. And a lot of people, not to throw stones at your family, but a lot of people do default to the will. They say, well, I'm just going to have a will because that's going to instruct where my stuff goes when I die. But first of all, the will doesn't do you any good during your lifetime. If you are incapacitated for some period of time before you die, the will doesn't do anything for you. You might have to go through a guardianship or conservatorship process to have somebody make financial decisions for you. And then when you die, the term probate means to prove the will. And so you have to go file a petition, have a judge admit the will to probate, have an executor appointed, and the executor exercises their duties as outlined by the will, consistent with the governing state statutes. And if your parents had property, or if the decedent had property in another jurisdiction, maybe your mom had a house in Arkansas and your dad had property in Georgia, well, you might have to go do a probate in Arkansas just to deal with the Arkansas property, then go through Georgia to do the same thing. And it just becomes an unpleasant, time-consuming, and public process that can be avoided. So anyway, this is a long-winded way of landing the plane, I think, but so much of what we focus on when we're dealing with clients of any significant wealth at all is privatizing the process, getting yourself out of going to court if you become incapacitated, or having your family go to court if you're dead, and asking permission, being subject to the schedule of the court docket, subject to the interpretation of the judge, and potentially risking having contested matters now airing dirty family laundry in a public venue. Losing knowing, I've been there firsthand several times with family members, including my mom, losing somebody that you love is really, really hard. It's hard enough without having to also subject yourself and the family to judicial proceedings that are confusing and where you don't have control of the process. And so when we talk about how to own, it really is about taking ownership of the process and being thoughtful in how you, whether it's around tax mitigation, whether it's privatizing processes, whether it's creating some level of protection from creditors during your own lifetime, whether it's about preparing people who will someday inherit what you leave behind. That's what we talk about when we talk about how to own. And then there's the jurisdictional question. There's the laws of Colorado, where I am, are not nearly as favorable as the laws of someplace like Nevada or South Dakota. So being strategic about what jurisdictions you do your strategies under to achieve certain objectives.
Well, and the other thing here is, I mean, you sort of already alluded to this, but I mean, so many things are changing all the time. Like the laws themselves change all the time. And maybe you want to talk about, changes in the estate tax that are coming up that I feel like a lot of people have no clarity in whatsoever. But even think about the impact of like the internet and digital accessibility to some of the things that we're talking about. If you live in an age where there's no internet and you actually have to go to the court of Newton County in Georgia to find the documents that we're talking about, like that'd be pretty hard. Like somebody would be working pretty hard to do it. You don't have to do that now. I was approved as the executor for my dad's will over Zoom. It wasn't a septuagenarian in robes. It was some lady in the office, and it took all of 3 minutes. But like, if it's that easy to do that, how easy is it to find the court proceedings that you're talking about, or learning, oh, well, he has this, that, and these other properties and these other places and things like that. So it's also sort of an attack on privacy there too. And it's funny, like I feel like when Bitcoin, I, like you, didn't really hear about crypto and Bitcoin until well closer to the pandemic, honestly. The George Friedman, who I used to work for, thought Bitcoin was nonsense, and I was sort of his right hand for a long time. So I reflexively took on his approach, and it wasn't until I broke away from him that I began to understand it a little bit more. But the concerns about privacy that used to seem outlandish, I mean, they seem really pertinent right now, especially when you look at the way monetary policy is going in the United States, when you think about the budget deficit, when you look at a Democratic and Republican Party that when it comes down to their tax proposals, it's just about where they're taking the money from. There's no fiscal conservative. There's no U.S. politician who is out there sort of leading the charge for, protecting people from more state involvement in their affairs. So I don't know where the question there is in that, but maybe talk a little bit about how fast things change and how it's, like you said, it's not that you put up a plan and then you put it on the shelf and 40 years later you dust it off. But that really you're having to sort of react to things in real time.
Yeah, I mean, the whole process should be iterative because everything is changing. I like to think of any estate plan as a snapshot of one moment in time, and it's, at best, it is the reflection of what you want at the moment that you sign it. But then kids grow up, objectives change, priorities change, the law changes, as you talked about. Excuse me, and you mentioned specifically the federal estate tax. Under the current, under what was signed in as the 2017 Tax Act when Donald Trump signed that, it doubled the federal estate tax exemption that each American taxpayer has. At that time, it was $5 million per taxpayer adjusted for inflation. And so the 2017 Tax Act doubled that and turned the estate tax exemption from $5 million plus indexing from inflation to $10 million plus indexing for inflation. So I have a $10 million estate tax exemption. My wife has a $10 million estate tax exemption. And that exemption can be used for gifts made during lifetime, as well as gifts made at death. It's like, think of it like a $10 million coupon that you can tear off in strips. You can tear it off for gifts that you make during your lifetime, or if you don't use it during your lifetime, you can apply it at your death. But this coupon does increase in value under the current statutes. The current estate tax exemption is now $13.61 million per taxpayer right now. But the 2017 Tax Act, like all tax acts have under the Byrd Amendment, it's got a built-in expiration date. And so the estate tax law, as it's currently constructed, is set to automatically expire at the end of 2025. So December 31st of 2025 is going to be the last day you can possibly die under the current estate tax exemption level. If you wait until 2026 to die, your exemption has now automatically been cut in half. And that is assuming Congress does not do something proactively to extend the tax code. But it's, the estate tax is a constant political hot potato tossed around from one party to the next. And we'll see what happens. I don't know that with the unusual exception of, I think it was 2011, when President Obama signed the new Tax Act 3 days after the new year that kind of rolled back and kind of retroactively applied the tax law. No estate tax has ever been allowed to end. So, I think it's probably anybody's guess as to what the estate tax law will really be in 2026. But we know that under the current law, it will cut in half. And that's just one example. A lot of states have a separate state level estate tax as well, which a lot of people don't realize. If you happen to be in a place like Washington State or Maryland or New York or a handful of other states, there is also a state level estate tax that usually kicks in at a much lower threshold. So like in Massachusetts, I think it's a $2 million estate tax exemption, and it indexes up to 16% tax rate above the $2 million threshold. So if you're a super wealthy person, you might not only have federal estate tax, but you could also have state level estate tax that could be as much as 55, 56% total tax erosion on your wealth if you're one of these super affluent people who have done no proactive tax planning.
As you were talking, Matt, you might have noticed me looking up. If you're looking at this on YouTube, you'll notice me. There was this large black crow that was attacking this like smaller bird's nest, and then these two birds came out of nowhere and they were attacking the black. So I'm getting to listen to you about estate planning, but I'm also getting a front row seat to planet Earth on the rugged streets of New Orleans while we're talking. It's pretty good stuff.
The mean streets as the raven comes for the young.
I wish that was as mean as the streets in New Orleans got.
There's something poetic. There's something poetic about that.
Yeah, if I'm sure that there's an Edgar Allan Poe AI that we could feed into and say, please write an updated poem about the adventure that's happening in Jacob's Yard.
And that raven could very well just be the estate tax looming over the to steal the hope from the young.
Exactly right. Well, I thought maybe a good next thing to do was because you called it the recursive function, but I want to play like proxy for the listener right now, because hopefully if I've done my job correctly, they're listening to you and they're like, I haven't thought about some of these things, and Matt seems trustworthy and Jacob only talks to mostly trustworthy people. So I'm assuming that if somebody came up to you and wanted to talk about these things, though, you wouldn't even be talking about things like taxes and trusts and structures. I assume that you would be starting with the why question. So if somebody's listening to this and was like, let's say that they came to you and they wanted to open up a conversation, like how would that conversation go from the start? What are the first things that you think about when you're starting to think through this type of structure for a client? And maybe that answer also changes depending on how big the client is. Before we hit record, you sort of talked about how you were having beers with someone and you were setting out the table stakes of estate planning. So maybe you want to put in some levels there too, but I thought that might be a useful sort of exercise for the listeners.
Yeah. The world of estate planning can feel somewhat mechanical if you're just looking at it from a distance, because a lot of what we do talk about is tax mitigation and how do we privatize the process? What kind of rules do we need to have in place? What kind of provisions do we need to have in place in order to ensure that level of privacy? But those are kind of mechanical decisions. A lot of the conversation really ought to be, and where we try to take the conversation with people is, what's it all about? You've spent your lifetime making sacrifices, whether it's innovating, building companies, foregoing vacations, often time away from the family to build stuff, and now you've achieved some level of wealth where you're now at least thinking about estate planning. Frankly, as I said before we started recording, some level of estate planning is just table stakes that everybody ought to do, even if they don't feel like they're wealthy. And we can talk maybe about some of what that would look like. But it really ought to be driven by the purpose of the wealth. What's it for? Because there are some people that we're fortunate enough to work with have tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars worth of wealth, And it's really easy as a strategist to get bound up in all the magic we can do around tax mitigation and asset protection and various thises and that's to shift assets around. But if we have not really thought through and inquired as to what the client wants from their wealth, then it's not really, we've done them a disservice. And so a lot of the conversation is around, if something were to happen to you, ultimately when something happens to you, whatever you leave behind for the people that you care about, what would you like that to mean to them? What kind of lives do you want your children to have as a result of this wealth? What kind of values are important that should be kind of imprinted on that next generation? And if you're not here to communicate those values and to kind of communicate an expression of love to your family, how can we make that, how can we at least create the planning in a way that is consistent with your expression of love or your values? And for a lot of clients, it means that some measure of philanthropy. For all the clients that we get to talk to, there's some level of responsibility and a sense of stewardship that goes along with that. It's about protecting your spouse in the event he or she were to remarry after you're gone. How do you prevent the wealth that you and your spouse have built together from accidentally becoming part of a new marriage, and then your spouse dies, and now you've disinherited your own kids in favor of your spouse's new husband or wife? And or how do you protect your kids in the event you die and they're in the middle of a bankruptcy proceeding, or they're in the middle of a divorce, or they're in the middle of a business failure? How do you prevent the stuff that you have spent a lifetime building from now just being dissipated by things beyond your control and things beyond your children's control? How do you prevent the kids from, or how do you structure it in a way that prevents the kids from just losing their minds? Maybe $500,000 or even $100,000 just dropped in the lap of an 18-year-old could be destructive. How do you prepare them to become the best versions of themselves if you're not here to shepherd that process? And so a lot of what we talk about, the why, is making sure that as we're designing strategies, as those strategies get implemented and as those get shepherded over time, we come back to this notion of, okay, is what we are doing consistent with how you see the world and how you want your wealth to impact your communities and the people that you care about? Knowing that just like the law is going to change, just like your wealth is going to change, just like the market is going to change, just like politics are going to change, your objectives are going to change, your family's going to change, and the kids that you're raising right now may look totally different 25 years from now.
One of the reasons that I find this so engaging and so important is because, and listeners might have heard me say this before, I know this is nominally a geopolitics podcast and that I am generally known as a geopolitical analyst. I hate the term geopolitics. I've come to hate it even more the older I get. It feels like a straitjacket. It's really about politics. And if you start breaking down what politics actually is, I think my Greek philosophy is outside of the view of the video right now. But I was rereading. This is going to sound pretentious, but whatever. This is how I live my life. I was rereading some of The Republic a week or two ago as I was doing research, and was reminded of the definition of politics, which is basically, you can define it literally, but it's really actually more about asking questions about how to live the good life. So what is justice, and what is happiness, and what is the correct regime, and what are the correct laws that enable the maximum amount of happiness for people who are within that particular polis or under that particular structure. And it's why, geopolitics, I feel like so many times it's like billiard balls on a pool table, or it's, you can think of these nerds like in their rooms with maps and they're pushing the push pins. Well, what if Russia does this? And what if China takes Taiwan? And the actual real question is not actually like, what if those things happen? Like, those are important questions. But if you really want to get into the depths of how politics is going to change, you have to understand how large groups of people think about the good life, and what are they going to do, and what sacrifices are they going to make, and what types of governments are going to establish the rules that are going to set the playing field, and how are those governments going to change over time? I think one of the most concerning things about the United States is the period of change that we're in right now. Like, we're going through generational changes. We're having a boomer generation get old and think about these questions, and Gen X and millennials underneath them, and you can feel the churn. Like you can see it in how politics is going on right now. So I just wanted to make that a little bit less abstract, because as you said, I think estate planning can sometimes become mechanical in the same way that politics can, but we're all orbiting the same questions here.
100%.
That was,
I
yeah,
totally agree, and that's why I really hate the term estate planning too, because estate planning is one of those kind of pretentious sounding terms in its own right. And it's like, well, I don't have an estate. It's like, yeah, well, I mean, you kind of do, but you think of estates as these, beautiful tracts of land with a castle on it someplace in, Scotland or something like that. And, I'm a lord of some estate. No, and people think of estates as planning for death. And it's not. I mean, it's really a lot like orienting your relationship with your wealth in a way that optimizes for happiness, that optimizes for privacy, that optimizes for other benefits, whether it's, again, taxes, income taxes, or whatever. And yes, it is also planning for what happens when this world goes on after you've slipped off this mortal coil. Because, you geek out on stuff like Aristotle and Plato. I geek out on stuff like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, and kind of come back to this notion of equanimity, and this notion from within Stoicism that, as bent as I get about politics, geo or otherwise, there's nothing likely I can directly do to influence that one way or the other. The best I can hope for is to orient myself in a way that I have peace, regardless of the external circumstances that I happen to find myself in, and try to then imbue those values in the people that I care about, that again will someday go on. The great philosopher Maximus, whatever it was, Russell Crowe's character in Gladiator, talks about, what we do here will echo into eternity. And I mean, that's very Marcus Aurelius. Obviously, Marcus Aurelius was one of the characters in that movie, but this Stoic notion that what we do right now matters, and at some point, I have to make a decision at some point as to how the people I care about will remember me, and will they remember me because I left a mess that was confusing, disorienting, and was just a mechanical transfer of my stuff to them? Or can I leave behind a sense of peace, a sense of equanimity, a sense of love that shows that I was thoughtful in how I oriented my affairs, that I mitigated some taxes where appropriate without just hamstringing and straitjacketing my family with structures that don't make sense, and equip my children. I've got 2 kids, and I've got a wife. Equipping my wife, equipping my kids to really have their best lives with the fewest number of distractions as possible. That's what, to my mind, that's what estate planning is. And it's not just one of these, again, distasteful, expensive tasks that you have to go sign a confusing stack of documents and say, yeah, I've got an estate plan. I don't really know what it is. I don't really understand it. It should be this living, breathing orientation of yourself with your stuff, whatever your stuff happens to be.
Not to make light of it, but I love a good zinger. Who could have really used an estate plan? I think Maximus could have really used an estate plan in Gladiator. Things might have gone a little bit better if he wasn't at the whims of Marcus Aurelius' son in that movie.
Yeah.
I'm also reminded of the Christopher Hitchens was once asked whether we have free will, and his response was, "Of course, we have no other choice." So you can either choose.
Right.
You can either choose to make these decisions, or the decisions will be made for you, but the extent to which you make the decisions can sort of change things. Matt, before we say goodbye, I thought we would close, and I just kind of want to tease some of the types of topics that we're going to talk here about monthly. And rather than go straight at crypto, because I think we're going to do entire episodes we should probably do entire episodes just on Bitcoin and just on Ethereum and like all these other sorts of things. But you sent over an article you wrote a couple of years ago for Estate Planning Magazine, and we can put a link in the show notes. But it was particularly striking to me as I was prepping to talk to you, because the discussion of money and the discussion of the history of like ledgers and how these things work over time, it was really, really powerful. So I thought with our last sort of 15 or 20 minutes or so, we've talked about what and where and how and why. But I thought the sort of off the wall question that I would ask you is, because you're coming at this also from crypto, but also from a more normal space as well. I doubt an Oklahoma kid, just like a Georgia kid, was thinking about anything like Bitcoin when they were coming up. Where do you see the future of money going? Like now that you've been rubbing shoulders with crypto going forward, I mean, you laid out some really good history there, and the article was written in 2022. So I wonder if anything's updated, or if it hasn't updated, it's just sort of how you begin to think about that concept, because I think it'll light our way towards our future episodes.
Yeah, that's a huge question. I think, and there are people that are far more scholarly than I am on this, but the way I see it, money is a social construct. It is some object or some commodity that we agree has saleable use in transactions. When we're not going to just barter with each other, if I don't have direct goods and services that you want, and if you don't have direct goods and services that I want, we need some type of saleable good that we agree has some type of illustration of value or some kind of substance of value to it that we can now exchange for. If I've got services, or if I want to sell you one of my cars, and you say, well, I've got like 5 hogs and 8 chickens and a cow, I'll give you for that. Well, I don't want your chickens and cows and whatever. It's like, okay, well, we have to come up with some type of medium we have to have some type of asset that serves as a medium of exchange, ideally also has some type of store of value quality to it as well, that ultimately is saleable to other parties. And as that article talks about, we've used that for gold, we've used that with stones, we've used that with beads, and now in the fiat world, we use that with forms of currency that sovereign nations will issue as a representative of national debt. It's fully backed by the national debt of some country. So Bitcoin came along in 2009, and it was promoted as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. When Satoshi Nakamoto issued that white paper at the end of 2008 and then launched the network in January of 2009, it was really designed as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system to have some type of asset that was inherently digital to allow people who were transacting with each other in only a digital realm to be able to exchange value for things. And so part of what Nakamoto really solved for, drawing on a lot of scholarship from other cryptographers and other monetary policy folks, Nakamoto was able to create a ledgering system that could ensure that you effectively couldn't spend the same money twice. That was one of the big problems that was prevalent in earlier versions of cryptographically secured currencies or crypto. And so Nakamoto solved this double spend problem by this distributed ledger network system. So if I was going to pay you a Bitcoin for various goods and services, I couldn't turn around and pay Rob or somebody else that same Bitcoin. I couldn't spend the same money twice. Nakamoto solved for that. And so as Bitcoin has evolved, it has I'm sure we will at some point go deep on how the network works, but it has become a broader based store of value as the network of users has grown, as it has kind of come into its own as an asset through 2014, 2017, through the launch of now exchange traded products on public exchanges. It has become this socially acceptable investable asset. And so Bitcoin has become a form of money. Um, but money at the end of the day is just something that a group of people decide has a representation of value that they can transact in when they can't otherwise barter with each other. And I think that, as I'm sure we'll get into on a deeper conversation about Bitcoin, there are qualities that Bitcoin has that make it the hardest form of money that humanity has found to this point. It's not just scarce, it is finite and absolute. And there are some risks that go along with that, but there are also some really interesting, it kind of predicts maybe some future long-term store of value growth in the value of the asset. And Bitcoin is unique in that respect.
It is, and for me, I'm always looking for symptoms versus causes. And listeners will know I'm fairly sober about this. So, like, I don't think the dollar is going anywhere as a reserve currency anytime soon. Like, I think a lot of that is overwrought. But that said, like, I do think we are moving towards a world in which the United States was the most powerful country in the world, and where the dollar was good enough for everybody, to where it's not good enough for everybody anymore. Like, look at how China and Russia are now trading in yuan, and China's buying a bunch of gold. Or look at places in Western Africa where the euro is actually displacing the dollar as the main form of trade settlement. If we got into places like, for instance, I think Turkey was having a lot of trouble because they were having runaway inflation, and they had to crack down on crypto because a lot of Turks were saying, well, this Bitcoin thing kind of makes sense in an environment where inflation is sort of going, 80, 100% and things like that. All of which I think is, I think Bitcoin would have been powerful. It would have been powerful at any time, and the concept would have been powerful at any time. But I don't think it's a coincidence that it came of age as globalization crested and as things started coming back from the brink. And I think the point about that you made about it as a new source of money, like, there are so many new sources of money and emerging sources of wealth, and things that might have been fungible in sort of apolitical ways, like even 20, 30 years ago. I mean, I hope we get back there for the sake of the world, but that's not the trajectory the world is going in. The trajectory of the world is actually, there's going to be less fungibility, and there's going to be different threats, whether they're political or from, stateless actors, hackers, all these other sorts of things that are going to be challenging for people. So we are going to talk a lot about crypto, but I think this is actually one area where crypto is not an exception here. It's actually part of a tapestry of a bigger whole. And so, like, if you're somebody who owns a bunch of real estate and you want to pass that on to generations, actually not that different than cryptocurrency. Or if you're somebody, you sort of alluded to this, if you have a bunch of gold, okay, where is the gold? Who's holding the gold? How are you getting it from point A to point B? Like, all of these are questions that we haven't had to worry about for some time, and maybe we won't have to worry about them. But I don't know, things are getting to the point where I think it's a question to ask. I don't know if you want to
I think
respond to that.
I do, and I think your points are right on. If you also think about the timing of when Bitcoin was created and released into the world, well, what was happening at the end of 2008 and 2009? The great financial crisis was really starting to hit its stride, and there was a lot of I think soul searching around the financial engineering that led to the economic downturn that the United States and then ultimately the rest of the world felt through that period. And along comes this asset that really cannot be devalued away. It is inherently disinflationary in its nature. And we can talk about how the algorithm works in another conversation. But then if you realize that Bitcoin hit the world in this time of the great financial crisis and kind of kept doing what it kept doing, going through a lot of its own evolutionary process during that time. But then we have the great money print that takes place during COVID, and we've just dropped this helicopter money all over American taxpayers or just citizens in the United States just get their free COVID money. Where the federal government just shows us that the value of the dollar really isn't that great if they're just going to make more of it, print it, and just drop it in your mailbox. And nations like El Salvador, who didn't have their own robust sovereign currency, but that were dollarized nations, realized that the Federal Reserve and the United States Treasury can just do whatever they want to with the United States dollar. And if these countries are dollarized, they have no control over what happens to the currency that they now transact in. And so, love him or hate him or someplace in between, what Bukele did in El Salvador was at least opt out of being a 100% dollarized nation and no longer being subject to the whims of the United States government, how it could impact the people on the ground in El Salvador. And we've seen the same thing now with Argentina with Milei. I'm not a Bukele and Milei apologist by any stretch of the imagination, but what Bitcoin allows not only other nations to do, but even allows Americans to do, is start to denominate part of their wealth in an asset that cannot be devalued by an issuing sovereign nation. You can't issue more Bitcoin for sovereign debt. You can't just drop helicopter Bitcoin on people, and Bitcoin just kind of does what it is, and it's like you can't just drop gold on people. It's like first of all, it would hurt if not worse, but it's a scarce asset. It's an asset that has inherent value just by the nature of how the asset is created, and Bitcoin has value in it's represented by the work that goes into producing it. And so I think that a lot of people now in this era of, I think it's hard to argue that we don't have runaway inflation. Because I think of inflation as the spot value of assets increasing relative to the value of the United States dollar. And that may not be a perfect scholarly interpretation of it, but it basically means that every dollar is buying less. And if you go to your local Ford dealership in New Orleans this afternoon and look at a brand new F-250 pickup truck, you're going to see that it's probably $95,000 to $100,000. Is the truck really worth $95,000 to $100,000, or is your dollar just worth less? Is Bitcoin really worth $70,000 per Bitcoin? It is, according to the market, but it's only worth that in part because the dollars that buy Bitcoin is worth less and less and less. And so we have this widening delta between the value of assets and the value of our currency. And so a lot of people are looking to assets like Bitcoin as an opportunity to hedge that delta.
Yeah, and there's two parts of that too, because if you can do it with Bitcoin, there's no reason you can't do it with your own personal data. There's no reason you can't do it with something like carbon credits. There's no reason that you can't sort of take control of these other things using the same sort of underlying technology. And the second thing I would just say there is, I'm not sure, like runaway suggests out of control, and I don't think that the horse is quite that far out of the barn. It's bucking against the stable, definitely. It's trying to kick the door down, and maybe it's gotten out and it's like tied to a rope, and now it's like trying to pull the barn off of its foundation. But I'm always reminded of if you go back and look at the history of British debt, one of these great things that we have data going back like hundreds of years because the British were great about doing these things. British debt surged in the early 1800s in the context of the Napoleonic Wars and fighting those wars and also maintaining their level of living at that time and all those other sorts of things. And it might have brought the British Empire down early, except for the fact that they but they went into India and subdued it with, a couple thousand dudes with guns, and India gave them a steroid boost. And suddenly you see debt starts to decline and the pound gets another 100-year lease on life until you get to World War I. I saw it was a study done by the Wharton School of Business where it was talking about the U.S. debt, which is $33 trillion overall. Right now it's $27 trillion if it's debt by the public. And it said, the United States has maybe 15 to 20 years before this debt gets completely out of control, where it won't be able to where it'll be paying more to finance its own debt, where people are going to be doubting the dollar's sort of status. And there were two things in there for me. That's like, well, that's the trajectory, and it's really bad. Just look at the CBO projections for Biden or Trump, where the debt goes from here. The second thing, though, is there is 20 years. So do you discover in India? Does a fiscal conservative rise? Does Javier Milei get U.S. citizenship and come to the United States and give concerts here? I don't know. But the point being, I don't think anybody can disagree with you on the trajectory. And like, if you're thinking long term about these sorts of things, I guess you sort of have to, like, what if the horse does bolt from the barn? Like, I think we are at that phase of the conversation.
Well, yeah, and I guess when I say runaway inflation, I guess to a certain degree I mean unaccountable. And for those of us who don't have any input in how decisions get made, short of one measly vote in a representative republic that doesn't really seem to be that responsive, it feels like it's runaway. I mean, I feel like I have no control over the value of the dollar today versus the value of the dollar a month from now or 6 months from now. And it seems like it's just continually re-engineering. And it's almost like we've got these mad scientists that are playing with some tainted DNA in a lab somewhere, and we keep getting these little monstrous iterations of a monetary policy that just is running away from us. I mean, that's why I feel it's run away, because I don't get the sense that there is an end in sight when our interest payments on our debt is in the trillions of dollars. That's a problem, I think. And if any household in the country or any company in the country were to run its books like the federal government runs its books, it wouldn't last very long. And we do have the strength of the dollar as a reserve currency right now, and we do, I think, at least arguably still have the most powerful military in the world, although I think the gaps are closing on all fronts. I think the competency gaps are closing in other nations. I don't know. I am not optimistic in the short term. I think I am probably neutral to moderately optimistic in the 20-year time horizon. But I think we've got a lot of pain between here and there. And fortunately, for people who own assets, they're going to see those assets go up in value, denominated by the dollar, in part because the value of the dollar is just going to continue to decline. That's, again, I'm just armchair prognosticator here. I'm talking way out over my skis.
No, I mean, everybody at all times is out over their skis. The difference between good folks and bad folks are the ones who know that they're out over their skis versus the ones that think they have, the secret truth of the universe being mainlined into their circulatory system. Which is to say, Matt, thanks for coming on. We're going to have you on once a month. And nominally, this will be about, things like estate planning and how to own and, interesting questions around that. But if listeners take one thing away from this, I'd like it to be not that we're going to be talking about estate planning, but we're going to be talking about how to live the good life and how to exert control over what you can in your own life, because there are many things that you don't control, but there are also some things that you do. And I think both you and I, in very different ways, are solving for, okay, like in this realm where you do have control over what's going on, here are some ways to think about that. Here are some tools to think about it. And that's where I think we'll try and keep the pitch of this podcast. Anything else you want to say to the listeners before we sign off, Matt?
I think that's a good way to wrap it. I just want to underscore the fact that estate planning shouldn't be scary. It shouldn't be morbid. Yes, you are sometimes dealing with heavy issues, but it really is. It should be part of just your ongoing financial dialogue about life. So yeah, I look forward to more conversations like this and exploring further as we go.
Sounds great. Hopefully next time in person, preferably in Colorado, as it's about to become a swamp here. So sounds good. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.